So really, it's my pleasure today to introduce Rachel Owen. She co-founded the Missouri Science and Technology, or MOST, policy initiative in 2016, and has served as the executive director since June of 2019. Owen received her PhD in the University of Missouri School of Natural Resources. She researched the impact of a changing climate on wetland ecosystems and landowner perceptions of climate and agricultural threats in the Great Plains. Prior to moving to Missouri, she completed her bachelor's degree in the agronomy and global resource systems at the marvelous Iowa State University and her master's degree in plant science from South Dakota State University. She serves on the board of directors for the Soil Science Society of America. Owen is also a soil science instructor at the University of Missouri, coaching the Mizzou soil judging team. So with that, I'll turn that over to you, Rachel.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction. Let me get my slides pulled up here. All right, can you see me full screen? I see it's loading. Yes, okay. Well, I'm so excited to be here today. As an Iowa State alum, it feels really cool to be coming back and talking to my old department. And so thank you again for inviting me to be here. Today, I'm going to be talking about growing the reach of soil science and really science in general through policy engagement, which is where I work now. As Dr. Miller mentioned, I am one of the co-founders and director of MOST Policy Initiative. So I'm based in Jefferson City, Missouri. I've been in central Missouri for about 6 years now, so it does really feel like home. And I do teach and coach the soil judging team at Mizzou. And so I've gotten really comfortable in black and gold, unfortunately, but I wore an Iowa State shirt to my first soil judging contest with the Mizzou team, and they were really disappointed in me. So I have a lot of black and gold in my wardrobe now, but I promise it's for Mizzou and not the University of Iowa. Okay, so with that, so I do want to talk a little bit real briefly about my journey into science policy, because it's definitely a unique career path for a soil scientist. So I did my bachelor's, as Dr. Miller mentioned, at Iowa State in agronomy and global resource systems, but let's face it, I was in soil science. I was soil science everything, was really competitive on the soil judging team. It was like my college sport. I really credit Dr. Manu and my soil judging coaches over the year for getting me into soil science. I'm really grateful I took a soil science class my freshman year. And really, when I was at Iowa State, I really only pictured my future career as being a tenure track faculty member or a researcher in soil science. I was convinced that was going to be what I was going to do with my career. So I went on and did my master's degree at South Dakota State University. There I was in soil pedology, so I studied how saline and sodic soils were distributed across the landscape. While I was there, though, something important to note is that I did a lot of work with farmers. I was engaging with farmers on my research sites. I did a lot of extension talks and really got a feel for what it was like to communicate science to people outside of doing scientific research. So they were using the research that I was doing, that my lab mates were doing, but they weren't, actually participating in the research themselves. And I really liked being able to talk about research to people who weren't doing research. So then I came down to Mizzou in 2015. My PhD, it was supposed to be in soil chemistry. I think it ended up being kind of soil ecology. Essentially, I'm a generalist. I looked at how wetlands respond to climate change in the Great Plains, did a lot of below ground work and a lot of above ground work, spent a lot of time in a greenhouse in the middle of the summer, which was not very pleasant. And while I was trudging along with my PhD research, I really let myself succumb to distractions, like student organizations and traveling to Washington, D.C., which was not necessarily the most favorite thing of my advisors, but was also something that I really started to enjoy while I was working on my PhD. And again, I think it was because, I wasn't necessarily in love with that everyday lifestyle of doing research, writing grants and things like that. But I really loved talking to people about science. And in particular, I really loved talking to people about science that was not my own. And so I, along the way, discovered policy as something that I enjoyed doing. I was able to get involved with our graduate professional council. So these last two pictures on here are not chronological. I was spending a lot of time in DC while I was doing my PhD as the director of national affairs for our graduate professional council. So I entered into the policy world really through higher education policy. I was talking about things like student loans and visas for graduate students, talking about things that, help graduate and professional students. But it made me, it got me exposed to what it's like to work in a policy setting. I spent a lot of time in Jefferson City, and at the same time, I was able to co-found MOST, which I'll talk more about in a bit. So I'm not going to go into too much detail right now. So before I get into more detail about what I do today, I want to break down what is science policy. And the cool thing to do, the thing that they always do in Washington, is that they'll break it down into two different areas of work. So first, there's science for policy. So that's using scientific information to inform policy decisions, like climate policy, agricultural policy. And then there's also policy for science. So that would be policies that are going to influence how we do science, like funding for research, things related to open access. I'll give some more examples here in a moment. Today, I work more in science for policy, but policy for science was actually where I really fell in love with policy. I was at a Hill Visit Day in Washington, DC, and we were talking with an agency director about how the appropriations or the funding that was coming from Congress, how that impacted how the agency distributed their funding to researchers. And that really, again, then further impacts researchers and their ability to conduct research. And particularly, we were talking about agricultural scientists and USDA funding. And it just really hit me that the people sitting in Washington, DC, voting on these decisions have a huge impact on research, but we don't really think about that impact very often when we're just, in the lab doing our science. So I really fell in love with policy, and that's where I work today. But science policy kind of falls in one of these two disciplines, and usually people work in one of these two spaces. Also, we tend to think about policy as only happening in Washington, DC, and that's where, the broad policy that, encompasses the entire country happens. But there's also a lot of political gridlock, and things move really slowly in Washington, DC. And so it's really important to remember too that policy is also happening at the state level and even closer to home at the city level. And so I'm going to talk through on the next few slides just some examples to show what science policy looks like at those different levels. And then I'll also point out I primarily work at the state level in Missouri, but state level policy and local policy, I really just want to emphasize that it's really accessible for scientists to engage at those levels. It's a lot easier to travel to Des Moines or to City Hall in Ames than it is to travel to Washington, DC. And so I'll emphasize some ways that scientists can get engaged more at the local level. Okay, so first, some examples at the federal level. And also, I missed the biggest science for policy example. I forgot to put the Farm Bill on here, but the Farm Bill is something that is certainly a place where scientists are going to be informing federal legislation. There's also a lot of other bills. The one that I know best on this list, I was just looking at bills that have been introduced in the 117th Congress, which is our current Congress in Washington, DC. The Growing Climate Solutions Act is the one that I know the most about. So that bill would help farmers participate in carbon markets. Right now, a lot of the carbon market bills, carbon pricing bills, exclude agriculture or exempt agriculture, but that's good for farmers not having to pay for using carbon, but it doesn't necessarily help them to get paid for sequestering carbon. And so the Growing Climate Solutions Act really needs information from scientists about how soils sequester carbon. It's a really important component of that bill. But then there's other things related to STEM education in rural areas. Disaster preparedness is a really huge place where climate modelers, geologists can get involved in helping to write that legislation. Sustainable Agriculture Research Act is another one. Some examples of policy for science, you're going to notice that policy for science, I always come back to funding. So appropriations are a huge way that policy influences science. So in soil science, that might be through NSF funding, National Science Foundation funding, or funding through the US Department of Agriculture. But there's also other laws that are going to go through that might impact a scientist's day-to-day access to resources and the scientific enterprise. So I found this one, Securing Helium for Science Act. You might all use helium in your labs. And so it'd be helping make sure that scientists have access to helium. There's also been several bills lately, good and bad, as seen by the scientific community, about open science or data transparency. And then, work visa policies are also really important to think about because so much of the work in soil science is done by international scholars and students. So that would also be an example of policy for science. Sorry, I'm having to move my Zoom pictures around just a little bit to make sure I can see the slides. All right, at the state level, so I pulled all of these science for policy examples from the Iowa website. So as we know, in Washington, D.C., Congress meets from January to December. They have some breaks in the middle, but they are there full year. During the full year, they're a full-time, congressional body. Also, I'm mostly talking about the legislative branch because that's what I'm most familiar with. Happy to answer questions about executive branch later. At the state level, though, the legislative branch only meets for 5 months. And this varies by state, but in Iowa, I believe that the state General Assembly only meets from January to May so they're about halfway done with their session right now. And so that puts a lot of pressure on the state legislators to look at bills and pass bills more quickly. So some bills that they're considering in Iowa this year, a renewable fuel standard, pesticide regulations, anaerobic digesters. That's certainly something that we can, that they're probably, is directly coming from academic research to make that law. Underground storage tanks is a bill that they're considering. But, in Missouri, we've written science notes on everything from biodiesel mandates to water quality standards and streams. There's a lot of bills that a lot of things are regulated at the state level, and that starts in the state legislature. And all of those topics really need science in order for them to be, the best possible policies. In the policy for science space at the state level, again, funding is something that's going to make a difference for researchers. So funding to the university in general impacts the day-to-day life of a tenure-track faculty member. And then I think it was a couple years ago, we saw that state funding was cut for the Leopold Center. I don't know how that ended, but I know that that certainly impacts research that can be done in soil science in Iowa. Some other examples, in Missouri, we just had a bill that would have changed the way that biospecimens like blood and saliva samples are handled at the state level. It would have put more stringent policies on Missouri than any of the other states, because there's kind of a national agreement right now of how those samples are handled. Well, you can imagine that medical researchers in Missouri would really be impacted by a bill like that was going through our state legislature. And sort of related to that, Missouri every year usually brings up a bill that would make it a felony for researchers to handle stem cells. Again, that's something that would have a really big impact on medical researchers in Missouri. And it would be at the state level. It wouldn't be a federal policy that would apply to people outside of the state. And then at the local level, it's a little bit more difficult to come up with specific examples. I tried looking around on the Ames City Council meeting minutes for a bit and couldn't find anything that was real clear, but some examples of things happening at the local level that I've dealt with. So in the science for policy space, one thing that we've seen in Missouri recently is that there's a lot of housing associations that don't allow solar panels to be put on roofs in their like subdivisions. And so the city can pass an ordinance that says that homeowners associations aren't able to ban solar panels. And so that's something that you might have a scientist who works in renewable energy come in and be able to contribute to conversations that they're making. Climate action, especially in a lot of the states in the Midwest, is happening at the city level. And I don't know if Ames has a city or has a climate action plan, but I know Columbia, Missouri, where I just moved from, they've really engaged with the scientific community in Columbia at the University of Missouri for that climate action planning to take place. Other things like planning and zoning, the easy example is thinking about floodplain development. Soil scientists are really well situated to be able to help delineate a floodplain and potentially help a city councilor understand how to make zoning so that they are discouraging development in a floodplain that's going to flood. And so that's something where scientific expertise can add to the conversation. And then parks and natural areas, maybe a happier example, but thinking about, how Ada Hayden Park can be designed so that it is, maximizing ecological benefits in addition to being a nice place for citizens of Ames to go. Those are all ways that science can inform some city level policies. As far as policies for science, I'll again go back to the funding. There's a lot of ways that cities can create tax incentives or tax disincentives for households and businesses. And so, I'll use solar panels again as an example. They might decide to give a tax credit for installing solar panels on your house, like you get a break on your property taxes. They could also do the same thing for energy efficiency, so on and so forth. All those different things that may be scientifically driven or may impact how households are making science-informed decisions. On the business side, a city can incentivize like a biotech startup to move their headquarters to a city by giving them tax breaks. I think Iowa, it was a state tax break that they gave to Google perhaps a few years ago. I hear this stuff from my mom, but I don't ever remember all of it. But you can incentivize companies to move to your town, to move to your county by giving them a break on property taxes or on business or income taxes for moving there. And then finally, the city council is responsible for appointing people to boards and commissions. And they are the ones who are the boards and commissions are often the ones who are making decisions and making recommendations about things like planning and zoning and environmental quality. Okay, so if I haven't sold you on the fact that it's really important for scientists to be engaged in the policymaking process, I want to give two more examples of why it's important that we have scientists acting in this role. So first is that legislative staff, while they are incredibly knowledgeable and are experts at what they are doing, often are not scientists. So this picture here on the left, I pulled it as a picture of legislative staff. I don't know if it's actually a picture of legislative staff, but this is what it looks like when you walk into an office in Washington, D.C. So you often have pretty young staff. They are often political science majors. They may have a law degree. So they're very well versed in policy and politics, but oftentimes they don't have scientific backgrounds. Now, there are some exceptions. One of the offices I've worked with in DC, their ag staffer has an ag education degree. So she, has some experience in working in agriculture, but she's not a scientist. She's not actively doing research. She hasn't done research in the past. So it's really important for scientists to help complement that expertise. At the state level, the staff looks the same, but there's a lot fewer of them. So a single member of the House or the Senate in Iowa might only have one or two staff members. And that means that those staffers are responsible for scheduling, dealing with constituent concerns, and maybe if they get enough time, they're doing some research on policy issues for their boss. But it's really important that when they do have to do that policy research, that they have access to good information and they're not just Googling and picking the first thing that comes up on a Google search on a scientific topic. So legislative staff resources are limited when it comes to scientific expertise. They're amazing and experts at what they do, but they don't have that scientific background. So scientists need to be engaged. The other reason why it's important for scientists to be engaged, and especially to bring kind of the scientific agenda to the table, and I use agenda because the Missouri lawmakers tell me I have to use that term, is that often people are coming to them and bringing scientific information with an agenda, right? So it may be a good or a bad agenda. So I tend to not think of lobbyists as being, horrible people, like is the connotation, but, the Nature Conservancy has lobbyists, Farm Bureau has lobbyists, Iowa Corn has lobbyists. All these organizations have lobbyists. They're coming to their policymakers, and they are making asks that, yes, have scientific backing, but are coming with an agenda. I'll use my husband's company as an example, and I'll keep this quiet, don't tell him this, but he works for the Fertilizer Institute. And that means that, he's doing a lot of science, he's contributing a lot of good science-based information to his lobbyist, but his lobbyist is still going to go to the Hill, and they're going to use that science in a way that's going to promote the fertilizer industry, or for our research and things like that. Perfectly valid thing to be doing, but it's coming with some agenda attached to it. And so it's really important as academic scientists or, grad students to be able to come forth with scientific information that's really just coming from you as a scientist. And I say it's an agenda because, even me, I want to get science into the policy conversation. That's my agenda. I don't think that's a bad agenda, and I'm trying to bring that information in an unbiased, non-agenda driven way, but I'm still hoping that they use the science to make decisions. This is something we learned early on in Missouri, is that they're going to assume we have an agenda. They're going to assume something about us, and so we might as well just be straightforward about why we're there. And that's to bring objective scientific information to the table. Okay. So scientists involved in this process is really important again. So scientific information, I just want to touch here on how important it is that scientific information is coming from somebody who a lawmaker trusts. So we all know that, or you can probably assume that a lot of the reasons why science doesn't get involved in conversations in the policy space is that there just isn't that scientific information accessible. So in Missouri, in Iowa, they may not know a scientist, they may be from a rural district, they maybe haven't, read any sort of literature on the topic. So that scientific information just isn't accessible to them. However, based on communication research, we know that if you're a scientist and you walk into their office and you give them the scientific information, it doesn't mean they're going to use it or believe it. It really is important for that science to be accessible, for them to have some sort of trusted relationship with you. And so our team in Missouri, so we really focus on building these trusted relationships. And that doesn't just mean that we are trying to learn about the lawmaker and their background and what's important to them, but it also means that we are talking to their constituents and getting out and learning about their districts. We are, coming to the table with dialogue so that we can understand their perspective, but also acknowledge that it's valid. So that might be something like, we're going to acknowledge that there might be a financial burden on a community because of a regulation, but we can still say, this water quality metric is important because Missouri mussels and fish are unable to survive if you have ammonia levels above a certain point, even though that causes a financial burden on the community. So we can acknowledge that there are these, gives and takes, and that science isn't the only part of the conversation. And that really helps us to build these trusted relationships. I will say that it takes a long time and it takes a lot of work to build trusted relationships with policymakers and to be seen as a trusted messenger. Granted, you do get some trust just by being a PhD level scientist. But a lot of NGOs and organizations out there, this is why, organizations exist and why they hire lobbyists, is to build these relationships for you. So that way, if you're a volunteer for the Nature Conservancy and you go into somebody's office, hopefully the Nature Conservancy has done a good job building a trusted relationship with that office. So that way you're not starting from scratch. But I do think as scientists, it does really help if you can build these relationships autonomously, because it is going to give you some of that, honest broker scientific credibility that you might need in those conversations. Okay, I'm going to do a time check quick, and then I want to go through some different examples of what this looks like on the ground. I'm going to primarily use my experiences here as a soil scientist because I don't really know a lot of soil scientists who work in policy. But I'll also bring in some examples of some of my colleagues and how they've worked at these different levels of government as well. Okay, so I will admit I'm going to focus mostly on state level policy and talking about what we do with most, but I also will talk about federal and local level stuff too. Okay, so federal level. So we'll start in Washington, D.C. So in Washington, D.C., lawmakers, while you may not believe it, I know I really have to convince my mom of this every time I talk to her about it, but lawmakers really do value constituent voices. So they value hearing from the people who are voting for them, voting for or against them, people who they represent in Washington, D.C. And constituent voices can be heard in a number of different ways. So you've potentially, I've talked about Hill visits or fly-ins. So they're just that. It's an organization may take a bunch of scientists or a bunch of their members, take them from Iowa to Washington, D.C., and then they go around the Capitol and they meet with all their lawmakers that day. So they meet with, a couple senators, maybe a few representatives, depending on who's in their group. And that's a really effective way for scientists to be able to have their voices heard and also be able to start building relationships, with their lawmakers, and more importantly, with the lawmakers' staff, because they're really the ones who are doing all the work. It's also, when they're thinking about constituent voices, though, numbers matter. And so you maybe have been asked to participate in a call campaign or a letter writing campaign before on an issue. And so in these cases, so I know that we sometimes get action alerts from the American Society of Agronomy or Soil Science Society of America if you're involved. And in that case, it's not necessarily true that they're going to read everything you send them, but they are going to tally and they're going to say, wow, okay, we received 100 calls from constituents today opposed to this bill. So we're going to take that into consideration when we make this decision about the vote. And so it really does matter to have those call and letter writing campaigns be coordinated. But anytime you call a congressional office, that does get recorded somehow. Anytime you write a letter, that stuff does get reported. They have staff who are specifically there to make sure that they're hearing from their constituents. And then the relationships really do matter. And I'll give a couple examples, but get to know the staff in field offices. That's one thing that is a good way to build relationships with lawmakers. And so field offices are their offices located in state. So I'm sure that Senator Grassley, Senator Ernst, they have offices that I can't remember who voted in your district for the House of Representatives anymore, but they probably have a location in Ames or a town nearby. And the staff in those offices are really excited when they get to know constituents. There also is probably a state ag director, would be another person who you could get to know, who works locally. So they don't work in Washington, D.C. They are strictly there to get to know people around the state. And then another way to build relationships is to reach out regularly to their D.C. offices, either through calling or emailing after you do a fly-in day. So I'll give a couple examples of where this has worked really well for me. So I've done a lot of fly-ins for soil science research funding, ag research funding, higher ed policy. But every time you do a fly-in, every time you go to an office, you get a business card of that staffer who you met with. And over time, you're going to, see the same staffer over and over again. I see the same staffer every time I talk about climate policy or ag policy for a lot of the offices in Missouri. And so I make sure that when things come up, I send them emails. So I send them a thank you email after we meet. But then if, right now an example is the Growing Climate Solutions Act hasn't been reintroduced yet. But when it does get introduced, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to send an email over to my senators' offices and my representative's office and say, hey, hope you're doing well. Did you see that this got introduced? We think this is really great for farmers. Hope that you will support this bill or consider being a co-sponsor. So reaching out regularly for things like that is important. And I guess my success story on that are a couple things that I've found to are a couple wins I've had. So first was that I sent one of those emails once, got a response back from the staffer for a former representative based in St. Louis. He said, oh, hey, this is great. We have this other bill that we're working on related to water quality. Do you know any scientists who are working in water quality? And I could say, yes, I do. And I got him connected to a couple of researchers at the University of Missouri who were able to then, provide expertise into that conversation. And then a relationship that I was able to build with Senator Hawley's staff. So Senator Hawley was only elected a couple years ago, and he had a brand new staff. And so when I was out there doing higher ed policy research, I was like the expert to their office about higher ed policy, which was great. Even though I was a grad student and was probably not, the best resource in the world, but he actually would send me bills that they were thinking about drafting and introducing, and I was able to give feedback on the bill text before they introduced the bills. And so that relationship was so important, and I was able to give a lot of feedback and have a lot of influence over how those bills ended up being introduced. So relationships matter. Getting in touch and building relationships with those DC offices, it's a little tough, but also really worth it in the long run to be engaged in that federal advocacy. Okay, so state level science advising, I'm going to talk about kind of the model that we've built with most. Iowa doesn't have anything quite similar. So I'm going to use Missouri as an example, but there are several states across the country who are working on similar type programs that we have with most that could be referenced as well. So Missouri, just to give you a little bit of context, fairly similar to Iowa's state level structure. So we have a Republican-led executive branch. We have a supermajority Republican-led House and Senate in our General Assembly. And so that means that Republicans could pass any bill that they want without worrying about the governor's signature because they could override a veto. But we have a lot of different types of Republicans in Missouri. So often there's a lot of infighting amongst the Republican Party, and the Democrats know that they have to work with the Republicans. And so we really do see a lot of bipartisan legislation that's going into effect in Missouri. And then we also in Missouri have a part-time legislature. So our legislators meet from January to May. But something interesting about Missouri is that we have the 4th largest General Assembly in the country. So we have a lot of legislators. We have a lot of senators and representatives, and that means that their staff are even more limited. So they have very few resources, and they are introducing thousands of bills every spring. And so we had a really unique position to be able to step in and say, hey, we'll be here to help you understand the science when you are considering these bills, and we'll get you the science when you need it. Which was something that they were really lacking before we started working. Well, they're still lacking it in a lot of cases. We're brand new, so I won't say that we are completely filling this gap yet, but oftentimes they are lacking scientific information, and that's the gap we're trying to fill. So I co-founded MOST when I was a graduate student at University of Missouri. It was started with our graduate professional council. My 2 co-founders are Hallie Thompson, who's the one on the far left, who's testifying at a hearing there, and then Mike Hendricks, who's in the middle with me there in that second picture. But we realized early on that if we were going to talk about science in a conservative state, that we really wanted to make sure that we were making it fit a model that would work well and be received well by our lawmakers. One of the ways that we did that early on was really stress that we're not just there sharing science for the sake of science. We really wanted to share science for the long-term health, sustainability, and economic growth of the people and places in Missouri. So we really focused on how science being incorporated into policy can help people in their districts, can help us preserve the state of Missouri and our natural resources over the decades to come. And that's been a mission that's been really well received by our policymakers. So I started working with MOST full-time after I finished my PhD in 2019. At the time, it was just me. And since then, we've grown to have 8 full-time staff and 4 part-time staff. So all of our full-time staff have masters or PhDs in scientific disciplines. We have backgrounds in a few different disciplines. So I have a PhD in soil science. We have an ag economist, someone who works in public health. We have a lot of microbiologists on our team, but at the state level, we cover a really broad range of topics. And so here I just wanted to mention that, we have masters and PhDs, and none of us cover exactly what we studied when we were getting our masters or PhDs. We really have used the skills that we obtained in our research in order to be able to broaden our scope of interest, to think critically about issues outside of just what we studied for our academic degrees. But we're all young and we're all really excited to be transitioning from careers in science to policy. And I think that energy has really helped us as we've gotten this organization up off the ground. We have two different programs. So the first is our Policy Fellows program. So that's where we place PhD level scientists at our capital in Jefferson City. They essentially act as nonpartisan research staff at our capital. So if a lawmaker has a question about any sort of scientific related topic, from education to natural resources to agriculture to transportation, they come to us and we put together a brief on that topic and try to get them as much information as they need in order to use it to make decisions. So we have 5 policy fellows right now. And that's the biggest part of our program. That's really why we got started, was we wanted to place these policy fellows. At the time, or over time, I guess I should say, we realized that there were a lot of scientists around the state in Missouri who also wanted to contribute to the policymaking process, but they didn't want to take 2 years off to do a full-time fellowship. And so we, last year, in collaboration with the American Association for Advancement of Science, launched the Missouri Local Science Engagement Network. And right now we have about 300 scientists who are members of this network who we alert to policy opportunities. So we'll tell them when there's a city council meeting in their area that is related to maybe a public health ordinance that they might want to comment on. We'll tell them when there's public comments at the state level available that they might be interested in commenting on. And then we also help them develop skills so that they can develop relationships with lawmakers and really position themselves to be trusted messengers of scientific information. And then we don't lobby, so we are specifically not registered lobbyists, and we are a nonprofit organization, but we're a 501c. This is tax stuff, you guys don't care. We're not lobbyists. And we really seek to engage and inform. So again, our agenda is to make sure that people have access to scientific information when they're making decisions. We don't tell them how to use that scientific information. We're just there to make sure that they have the access to it. We work both with lawmakers and with scientists to identify what some of those scientific topics might be. And then we share science in various forms, but the predominant way that we share science is through science notes. So again, because we aren't from public policy backgrounds, we've kind of been able to break the rules a little bit, and it's been kind of fun. But lawmakers, they get a lot of white papers, a lot of policy memos, a lot of policy briefs that come across their desk. But we wanted to call the things that we're writing something a little bit more unique. So every bill in Missouri has to have a fiscal note attached to it. And so we call these science notes because we want lawmakers to, become institutionalized to the fact that they're going to get the relevant science related to a bill when they're considering that bill in committee, just like they would get the relevant financial information with a fiscal note. So we call these science notes, and it's been a term that's been really well received by our lawmakers. But they're essentially a 2 to 4 page literature review of the topic. We include a summary and highlights on the first page, so that way lawmakers don't have to read the whole 2 to 4 pages if they don't have time. We also only provide these on request, and so we don't give unsolicited information. We're really trying to position ourselves as working for the legislature and providing things that they want to be able to see. And this slide is always outdated. I think at this point we've submitted over 70 of these science notes. We wrote 9 last week, which is insane. Our fellows, I don't know when they sleep, but lawmakers, this is our first year down at the Capitol in Jefferson City, and everybody asked, did people actually, are people listening to you? Do they want the resources you're providing? And this number is monumental. We're covering about 10% of the bills that get heard in committees every week, which I think is phenomenal. I think that means that legislators are really interested in the information we're providing. Our science notes have been used during floor debate, which is, right before a bill gets perfected and sent to the governor. They're using our scientific information in order to make decisions. So we've been really excited about that. So essentially, I should wrap it up in some way, but this is all to say that at the state level, lawmakers really need information, and they're really hungry for trusted scientists who can bring them that information. And so we work with experts across the state when we write these science notes. So it's not that you have to do this full time. There's a lot of space for experts to come in and be able to help in providing this information, even if it's just, an hour of your time, a couple hours of your time, instead of doing this on a more regular basis. And then finally, the example I'll use for local policy is to serve on local boards and commissions. So I was appointed to my city's Environmental Quality Commission last year, which hasn't met at all since I got appointed, so it's not a very fun story to tell. But my commission does things like we are currently working on a watershed renovation plan. So I'm able to serve as a scientist on that board, be able to contribute to what the city is going to do about this watershed over the next decade, which feels really impactful to me. A couple of my friends here, Dr. Feng Peng's son, he was recently added to the advisory board for Kansas City Climate Action, which is their climate action planning committee. Kelly Jones-Jamsgard down here in the corner, she has her PhD in medicine. She got her PhD at Kansas University of Medical Center. I can't remember what it's in, but she serves on the County Board of Health in the Kansas City region. And then this is my good friend Abra. She is a civil engineer, and she recently got appointed to the Climate Action Committee in Columbia, Missouri. And so there's a lot of space for scientists to be involved in these local boards and commissions that are making a lot of important decisions, usually without a lot of scientists engaged in that process. So I think I'm over time. I want to leave some time for questions, but I'll just throw this slide up here quick as some resources, science policy resources that you may want to access. I would say the biggest resource for scientists is your professional societies. So whether you're involved in the Tri-Societies, AGU, ESA, get involved and see what science policy resources they have. And then AAAS, ESAL, and NSPN. Sorry, this is like my slide of acronyms, but they also have really excellent science policy resources if you are interested in learning more. And if you're a student, I wanted to throw this down here at the bottom, but there is a graduate student organization at Iowa State specifically focused on science policy. It's called Aspire. So that's a group that you could look into as well. I don't know if you're sharing these slides, but I'll send you all this information since I kind of rushed through it here. This is my last slide. So I just want to be sentimental here for a moment, but my best friends in the world, I met at Iowa State. So I'm really excited that I got to come back and talk. And I also met my husband while he was a PhD student at Iowa State. So Iowa State has been really responsible for a lot of really important things in my life. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Owen. And really, Iowa State is very happy to have you represented coming from our university. So we'll open up for questions. I'll keep an eye on the chat, but also we're a small enough group that if you want to ask your question live, certainly encourage you to do that. Looking at the chat here, I see top of our list, Dr. Jerry Miller. So go ahead.
Thanks, Bradley, and hi, Rachel. I'm emeritus professor at Iowa State, so I have a comment, and then I will ask you a question. So my comment for my colleagues at Iowa State is that we have a government relations office, both federal and state, and our government relations office reports directly to the president, and those individuals are generally in DC. And then, of course, the state relations office folks are obviously in Des Moines. So Rachel, does the university, and before I make that question, the other LGUs in the North Central region that I'm familiar with are set up similarly. Is University of Missouri have a government relations office? And if so, do you interface with them?
That's an excellent question. And Dr. Miller, I believe that you probably had a lot of really policy relevant experience, if I'm recalling correctly. Working with CSR maybe, but yes, so government relations offices, They vary in how stringent they are. I think at Mizzou, our government relations office was kind of torn apart with the last administrative change at the top of the university system. And so my government relations officer doesn't really care what I do, which has been nice. But also he has been really helpful when I've needed, contact information or some advice on how to remain apolitical and things like that. So I think at Iowa State, they're a little bit more, they really want their scientists. If you're going to talk to somebody in DC, go through your government relations office. I had a little bit more flexibility in Missouri.
Thank you.
I'm going to go, I see some hands raised. In the order I see them, I got Marshall McDaniel and then Michael Thompson.
Thanks, Bradley. Rachel, good to see you again. Thanks for the great talk. And say hi to John for me, too.
I will do that.
I am curious at what you're seeing. I know a lot of this is just kind of getting off the ground and you really get like ramping up your engagement, it seems like, with those policy notes. But what is your sense with the changing in politics and kind of distrust in professionals and in general, but scientists, misinformation going around? Are you finding your job getting more challenging? Are you, what are you seeing on the ground with regards to that? Because I feel like that's a trend, but maybe that's just me.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And so we started MOST in 2016, completely unintentional, that it was related with the Trump administration timing. That was when we started thinking about this. But in the last 5 years, we certainly have had a lot. Science has become very political, and our goal is to stay apolitical. And so that means that we have to be really cautious about a lot of the things that we're talking about. Like we get questions about abortion science and what are other, and climate science is still, a controversial topic. And so so yes, we have to be very careful about how we talk about those issues in order to avoid being political, I would say. But knowing that they're going to be political regardless of what we do, we also, that's where those relationships come in handy. If somebody knows me as, Rachel Owen, who is a soil scientist, who goes to the local church, who, runs half marathon. I don't run half marathons. I don't know why I said that. Then they're maybe more likely to trust me than if they just see, this woman who has a PhD walk into their office, because every time I walk into an office, if somebody doesn't know me, they assume I'm liberal. And so it's been something that those relationships have been really important in helping to overcome. But also, we have to be careful about how we discuss it. In Missouri, I will say, we get requests from Republicans and Democrats and about the proportion that they are at in the legislature. So about 60% of our requests come from Republicans, 40% come from Democrats. I haven't met a politician yet who doesn't want more information. They may not use that information, they may not, draft their bill based on that information, but they want to know the information. And so that's been my experience, and really those one-on-one relationships have really helped, I think, to overcome some of the political barriers.
Dr. Thompson.
Hi, Rachel. I was really impressed by the legislative notes, and super impressed that you've got 70 out since January. Boy, if I had that kind of publication record, I would be on top of the world. And I can really imagine that they have an effect like you described. That's just fantastic. So I have some questions about how they work. Like, one question is, do you really wait until you get a request to start drafting a note, or do you have some kind of in the back of your mind that you kind of work on, and then they're sort of ready when you get a request? That's one question. And another question is, in those notes, do you comment on the legislation that is in front of the legislator? Do you say, well, if you do this, here are the science implications, or if you do that, here are the science implications? Do you get into the policy options, or is it just all kind of background information for the legislators to consider?
Yeah, so I'll start with your first question. So how much of the work do we do in advance? So I will say, our fellows started in September. Our legislative session started in January. So last fall, they were doing some research on bills that had been, almost passed in the past and didn't quite get through. So we knew of what some of the major topics were going to be, and we started putting information together. I'll use biodiesel mandates as an example. It almost passed last year. So our ag fellow, she, started gathering information in October so she could have a science note ready by January.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also a lot of topics that we get asked to write about like on Friday, and they need to be turned around by Monday. So my fellows do a lot of working over the weekend, unfortunately, but like in education policy, that comes up all the time. Last week, our education fellow got 5 requests on Thursday for bills that they wanted to, that were being heard the next Tuesday. And so she turned around 5 of these science notes in a weekend. And I think 3 of them were brand new topics that she'd never thought about before.
Wow.
And so we have some checks and balances in place to make sure it's still good background information. But we also, sometimes are turning these around pretty quickly. And then they're mostly background information. We do mostly what we do for policy like analysis comparison is that we will say, other states have passed this bill. Here's what's happened in other states related to the outcomes that we might expect in Missouri. A lot of them are new legislation that's only been passed in other states in the last couple of years. And so we don't have the ability to make those sort of projections. But we try not to get into policy analysis, and we don't present alternative options because we're giving them these science notes when they're considering a piece of legislation that they've already decided to introduce. So we don't give too much of the like policy alternatives information.
Great. Thank you.
So Dr. Owen, I actually have a question that's pretty well connected to Dr. Miller's comment in question. So and maybe it's a 2-part question, but there's 2 main restrictions that we as faculty have to be very cognizant of for how we might comment on policy. So one, we're state employees. So there's limits, and we'll have to be careful not to be advocating as a state employee. And then 2, of course, is the university organizing its message to legislators. And both those are for a good reason. So certainly the university wants to coordinate messages. So I guess, so on that side, any advice you have for working with those university people, because certainly soil science isn't always top of the mind at the university level. So within those confines, any advice you might have for when we see an issue that we want to maybe even be tempted to advocate for, because we maybe want to advocate for soil science. So any thoughts on that area?
Oh, that's a really good question. If you had an organization like us in the state, and I don't know what the equivalent would be, we work with people at universities all the time who don't like put their name on what we're doing at all, but they review our information. They're able to give us like a science-based foundation for how we present this information to lawmakers. And I know that, building relationships with legislative staff, they might reach out to you and allow you to do the same thing. You're not necessarily advocating one way or the other, but you are serving as an expert as that policy is being drafted. As far as things coming up, like if you see a piece of legislation that is bad or really good and you want to, comment on that, I think that going through the government relations office is probably the best option if you want to speak in your capacity as a university researcher. I think what I've seen a lot of like not state employees, maybe state employees do occasionally, but I think they're really limited in Missouri, is that if you're speaking on behalf of yourself as an individual and a voter and a citizen, then you have a little bit more flexibility. At the same time, like I know that my advisor was a federal employee, and so she was always really careful about anything, advocating publicly about stuff, but she would, do March for Science and be very upfront about it because that's her, ability to advocate as a private citizen. And so I think it's a touchy subject and something you should talk with government relations office about, see what they're comfortable with, but you can always, call an office, support a bill, oppose a bill as a private citizen.
So Bradley, I might just comment based on my experience in administration at Iowa State. So there's three things that can happen. One, you have, as a citizen, you have a legislator, both a senator and House member in Des Moines, and you can always, as a citizen, there's no provisions to prohibit you from talking to your own legislators. The second thing is that the legislator can invite you to come to a hearing, and all that we've ever asked as an administration at the college and university is that you let your department head and the dean know, hey, legislative Senator or Representative X invited me to come to Des Moines to sit in on a committee meeting. And then the third thing that happens, and which is really how we get a lot of the faculty involved, is that the legislator will send a proposed bill to the government office, the government relations office, and they'll ask for comments. And so if that's in the College of Agriculture, that comes over to the dean, and the dean would hand it off to one of us associates, and we'd say, okay, well, looks like Bradley Miller would be the faculty member that could address that. So we would send that over, and you'd have about 24 hours to turn it around, Bradley. So those are the three things, at least how Iowa State functioned. And with President Winterstein there, I'm assuming that's probably still the policy and the procedures that work for the government relation offices at Iowa State.
So
Thanks for letting me clarify or comment on that. Didn't mean to take your microphone, Rachel, but
I don't know how this works in Iowa, so that's great to know.
yeah, I think that's very useful for all of us to think about. Actually, Dr. Merrill, let me ask you for the reverse. That's kind of the top down, but if it's a little bit who they know, any advice for, so it's not so much about advocacy, but making sure that we're on their radar. So when such issues come up, they know that we're available. Any thoughts from kind of the bottom up side of making sure we can be part of the conversation when appropriate?
Yeah, and again, you have, as a citizen, you have legislators that you can talk to. So that's probably the easiest way to do that, is say, hey, Representative or Senator X, I have some expertise on this subject, and I want to share it with you. And hopefully, you can put a caveat in there. You're welcome to share that with the appropriate committee or whatever. Yeah. But if I did that, I'd probably let government relations office know that hey, I talked to my local representative or senator and provided this information. So, the old story is no surprises.
I'm curious too, and sorry, I don't need to ask the questions, but like if you were part of your local citizens climate lobby chapter and they invited you, so they have the relationship with the lawmakers, and then they they recommend you as an expert to the lawmaker to come in as an expert witness on something. How does is the university okay with that? Like if you are part of external organizations that help you build those relationships?
If you're asking me, yes, if you're part of an organization, you could go and represent that organization for whatever it is, for Soil and Water Conservation Society or ASA or whoever. You could do that. Again, I would just let my department, I'd let Dr. Lamke and the dean know that what I'm doing. No surprises.
Yeah, when I was a grad student, every time I went to DC, we always let the government relations office know, even if it was for an external, if I was there for a ASA visit or anything else.
Very good. I don't see any other questions in the chat or any hands up. So with no other questions, thank you, everyone. Thank you again, Dr. Owen, for your presentation. Generally, I think it spurred a lot of us thinking about how to approach these kinds of questions. I'll remind everyone that we have our soil science seminar again next week. We jump outside the United States. Agata Horel from the Hungarian Institute of Soil Sciences will be talking to us about soil redistribution in vineyards. So a slightly different crop system than we see commonly across Iowa. So thank you very much and have a great evening.